All right, we're going to look into what is a bacteria, what is a virus, what's the difference between them, how are they structured differently, how do you treat them if you get an infection like that. So we'll start with bacteria. So basically, first thing you need to know is that there are two categories of living things on Earth. There are prokaryotes and there are eukaryotes. That's how you pronounce those words. Prokaryotes, means they do not have a nucleus, and these include all things bacteria. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus inside their cells, and that is everything that is not a bacteria. So that includes plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So the four kingdoms of life there. There are multiple kingdoms of life in bacteria. The broadest classification of living things is called a domain, and then the domains get split and broken up into various kingdoms of life, and then it gets broken down from there into phylum, class, order, and so on. In the domains, there are two separate domains of bacteria, and there's one domain of all the eukaryotes, and then the kingdoms of life are broken out for them. For each of the domains of bacteria, there is a single kingdom of bacteria, eubacteria and archaebacteria. We're not going to get into the differences between those here, but you should know that they are very different enough from all the eukaryotic organisms that they have their own domain as well as their own kingdom. Okay? A prokaryotic cell is a very simple thing. All bacteria are generally unicellular. They're made of one cell. They do sometimes live in big colonies linked together, but they are not multicellular organisms. If you look inside of them, there's a cell membrane and a cell wall, and then there's just DNA floating around in the middle of the cytoplasm. There is no nucleus containing that DNA. That's how they get the name prokaryotes. And that's what distinguishes them basically from most of the other kingdoms of life. That, and there's very little complexity inside of them. There's no other real main organelles that do any other kind of work. What is a bacteria? It is a tiny one-celled living organism, and that's going to be a distinct difference from when we look at viruses. Bacteria are made of cells. They are alive. Some of them are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. Some of them use chemicals to make their own food as autotrophs. Some of them are photoautotrophs, which use sunlight similar to plants, and they're able to do photosynthesis. But some of them actually feed on other organisms to get their energy. They may live alone or they may live in big colonies, and there are three basic shapes of them, and that kind of helps with their nomenclature. So there are coccus, which is a round bacteria. Spirillum sounds like spiral, and that's what they are. They're kind of corkscrew shaped. And then there's bacillus, which is kind of like a tic-tac. So this is a bacillus shaped bacteria. Here you're looking at an electron microscope picture of them. They are really, really tiny cells. These are E. coli cells. They are rod-shaped bacillus bacteria. There are coccus, or cocci is plural. They look like little Dippin' Dots or, Cocoa Puffs. And you'll see how their name can kind of fit into what shape they are. And then there are different, extremities of spirilla. Some of them might be more tightly spiraled or more loosely spiraled, but they're spiral-shaped bacteria. How do they actually reproduce? First, they make a copy of that single loop of DNA that they have. And then they split in half. So it's super simple, super easy. The new bacteria is an exact identical genetic copy. This is fission is their way of dividing. Now, they don't always come out exactly the same because sometimes conjugation occurs. This is where bacteria will actually link together and they will swap pieces of DNA amongst each other. Okay, normal bacterial fission is very simple like this. They duplicate their chromosome, their DNA, and then they just split into two equal-sized daughter cells. Here's an actual electron microscope picture of it. Okay, conjugation is where they take this thing called a pilus, they stick it into another bacteria, and then a small piece of DNA that's a tiny little loop called a plasmid can get transmitted through that loop into the other donor bacteria. So they will actually exchange pieces. This is not actually reproduction. They're just swapping DNA with each other. Okay, now once you have a bacterial infection, what do we actually do with it? Because the ease with which they reproduce they can reproduce very quickly, such as if you have 4 bacteria on your hand, within 24 hours, depending on the type of bacteria, you could have 2 million bacteria in your body. Okay? So when we treat those, we use antibiotics. Bio means life, anti means against. So these are chemicals that are specifically designed to kill living things. You can have antibiotics that are working against a fungus. You can have, other types, but the antibiotics that kill bacteria are usually a derivative of some other kind of organism like mold or fungus or some other kind of bacteria. Nowadays, we have some chemically created antibiotics that we can use, like Biaxin or something like that. But, the first one was penicillin, and that was coming from the Penicillium mold. So that chemical is actually a poison to the bacteria, and it kills them. Okay? If you take antibiotics, you have to take them for the full term. This is important because if you start to take them and you kill off all the weaker bacteria that are not naturally easily affected by this poison, then you're leaving behind, if you stop taking the antibiotic, you leave behind the ones that are stronger and are more resistant to the poison. And then they will just repopulate because they repopulate asexually. They don't need a partner. So you'll get a whole lot of these clones of bacteria that are resistant to these. And this is how we end up, getting bacterial strains that are antibiotic resistant. Sometimes new strains will form because while the DNA is getting copied, a natural mutation occurs in the bacteria. And then you have 2 different strains because one of them was mutated. And as they asexually reproduce, now you have 2 completely, different strains of whole populations. Okay, so once the new bacteria comes out slightly different, its offspring are going to be exactly like it. You got this whole new strain, but sometimes conjugation can also create new strains. All right, so that's how we get all these different strains. For instance, if you have E. coli, you could get a different strain of E. coli. Some of them might be poisonous and some might not. Okay, the antibiotic resistance happens because when there's mutations, the more times that bacteria get exposed to specific antibiotics, the more chances there are that there's a mutation out there that makes it resistant to that. Under natural selective conditions, the stronger bacteria that are natural might outcompete the other ones, and the ones that are resistant to bacteria might just die off. They might not be able to outcompete the other ones. But if you kill off all the ones that are antibiotic resistant, then they won't get killed by the antibiotic. They'll repopulate. And what we need to do is just start using less antibiotics to prevent infections. We only need to use them to treat infections. Okay? Some different bacterial illnesses that you might have heard of, things like Lyme disease, tuberculosis, staph infections, which are caused by Staphylococcus aureus. This is the scientific name of that strain of bacteria. There are strep infections, like if you have strep throat, that's caused by a streptococcus infection. Notice both of these are coccus bacteria, so they're the round type. Tuberculosis affects the lungs, and as it grows and develops inside the lungs, it leaves like poisons and toxins inside there behind it, damages your lung tissue. You've got bacterial meningitis, which affects the nervous system. Cholera is a bacteria that you typically see people getting from tainted drinking water, where it's mixing with sewage or something like that. So if there's a flood or a tsunami, you always see a cholera outbreak coming out from that. And it causes people to have severe diarrhea, and they often die from dehydration, ironically from drinking water. Anthrax is a bacteria that was actually used as a biological warfare agent. And so that is a bacteria. There are many, many other types of bacteria. Now, are they all bad for us? No. We actually couldn't live without many of them. Some examples of that: we've got E. coli bacteria that live in our intestines. This is a mutualistic relationship we have with them. And they help us, give us vitamins and digest foods that we can't normally digest. We give them a nice, safe place to live. There are many varieties of bacteria in the nitrogen cycle that help process nitrogen so other organisms on the planet can actually access and use the nitrogen. And you can't build a protein or a DNA molecule without having a lot of nitrogen. So we depend on those types of bacteria out in nature to be able to process nitrogen for us. In addition, many bacteria are decomposers. So without them decomposing and breaking down the nutrients in dead matter, we would just have piles of dead plant and animal matter laying all over the place, and it would never decompose, and we'd never be able to recycle and use those atoms and those nutrients. Okay, so we do depend on bacteria a lot. There will be a second video that will go through viruses and what they are, so you'll want to watch that one as well.